the President of Indonesia.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates and representatives, today, in addressing this session of the United Nations General Assembly, I feel oppressed by a great sense of responsibility. I feel a humility in speaking to this august gathering of wise and experienced statesmen from east and west, from the north and from the south, from old nations and from young nations, and from nations newly reawakened from a long sleep. I have prayed to the Almighty that my tongue will find those words which are adequate to express the feelings of my heart. And I have prayed also that these words will bring an echo from the hearts of those who listen. It is my great pleasure to congratulate the President upon his appointment to his high and constructive office. It is also my great pleasure, on behalf of my nation, to offer a most heartfelt welcome to the 16 new members of the United Nations.
The Holy Book of Islam has a word for us today. The Quran says, in my language, "Hai sekalian manusia, sesungguhnya aku telah menjadikan kamu sekalian dari seorang lelaki dan seorang perempuan, sehingga kamu berbangsa-bangsa dan bersuku-suku, agar kamu sekalian mengenal satu sama lain. Bahwasanya yang lebih mulia di antara kamu sekalian ialah siapa yang lebih takwa kepadaku." I might translate that as, "O mankind, I, Allah, made you from a male and a female, and divided you into nations and tribes, so that you should come to know one another. In truth, those who are most noble before God are those who most are in awe of Allah and do good works toward Allah." And the Christian Bible too has a word for us. "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to men of goodwill." I am deeply moved indeed as I survey this assembly. Here is the proof that generations of struggle have been justified. Here is the proof that sacrifice and suffering have achieved their end. Here is the proof that justice has begun to prevail, and that some great evils have already been banished. Furthermore, as I survey this assembly, my heart is filled with a great and fierce joy. I see clearly that a new day has dawned, and that the sun of freedom and emancipation, that sun of which we have dreamed so long, is already risen over
Asia and Africa. Now today, I address the leaders of nations and the builders of nations. But indirectly, I speak also to those you represent, to those who have sent you here, to those who have entrusted their future to your hands. I greatly desire that my words shall strike an echo also in those hearts, in the deep heart of humanity, in that great heart from which has been brought so many shouts of joy, so many cries of sorrow and despair, and so much love and laughter. Today it is President Sukarno who addresses you. But more than that, though, it is a man, Sukarno, an Indonesian, a husband, a father, a member of the human family. I speak to you on behalf of my people, those 92 million people of a distant and wide archipelago, those 92 million people who have lived a life of struggle and sacrifice, those 92 million people who have built a state upon the ruins of an empire. They and the people of Asia and Africa, of the American continent and the European continent and the people of the Australian continent, they are watching and listening and hoping. They see in this organization of the United Nations a hope for the future and a prospect of the present. The decision to attend this session of the General Assembly was not an easy one for me to take. My own nation faces many problems, and time to solve those problems is always short. However, this is perhaps the most important assembly yet held, and all of us have a responsibility to the rest of the world as well as to our own nations. None of us can escape this responsibility, and surely none wish to. I am very sure that the leaders of the younger and the reborn nations can make a very positive contribution to the solution of the many problems facing this organization and the world at large. Indeed, I am confident that man may once again say, the new world is called to redress the balance of the old. It is clear today that all major problems of our world are interconnected. Colonialism is connected to security. Security is connected to the question of peace and disarmament. Disarmament is connected to the peaceful progress of the underdeveloped countries. Yes, all are connected and interconnected. If we succeed in finally solving one problem, then the way to the solution of all the others will be open. If we succeed in solving, for example, the problem of disarmament, then the necessary funds will be available to assist those nations which so urgently need assistance. Very briefly, the principle which must be followed "5 years ago, 29 nations of Asia and Africa sent their representatives to the Indonesian city of Bandung. 29 nations of Asia and Africa. Today, how many free peoples are there? I will not count them, but look around this chamber now. Then tell me whether I am right or not when I say that this is the time of the building of nations and the time of the emergence of nations. Yesterday, Asia, and that is a process not yet completed. Today, Africa, and that too is a process not yet completed. Furthermore, not all nations, the nations of Asia and Africa, are yet represented here. This organization of nations is weakened insofar as it rejects the representation of any nation, and especially of a nation which is old and wise and powerful. I speak of China. I speak of what is often called Communist China, which is for us the only real China. This organization is greatly weakened precisely because it rejects the membership of the biggest nation in the world. Every year, we support the admission of China to the United Nations, and we will continue doing that. We do not give our support merely because we have good relations with that country, and certainly we do not do so from any partisan motive. No, our position on this question is guided by political realism, by short-sightedness, excluding a vast nation, a nation great and powerful in terms of numbers, culture, the attributes of an ancient civilization, a nation full of strength and economic power. By excluding that nation, we make this international organization much weaker, and so much further from our requirements and our ideal. We are determined to make the United Nations strong and universal and able to fulfill its proper function. That is why we consistently support the representation of China in our number. Furthermore, disarmament is a pressing need of our world. This most vital of all questions should be discussed and solved within the framework of this organization. Yet, how can there be a realistic agreement on disarmament if China, one of the most powerful nations in the world, is excluded from the deliberations? Representation of China in the United Nations would involve that nation in constructive world affairs and would thus immensely strengthen this body. We are determined that the fate of the world, which is our world, will not be decided above our heads or over our bodies. It will be decided with our participation and cooperation. Decisions vital to the peace and future of the world can be decided here and now. Here are heads of state and heads of government gathering in one place. There is the framework of our organization. I very sincerely hope that no questions of rigid protocol and no narrow feelings of hurt personal or national feelings will prevent this opportunity from being used fully. A chance like this does not come often. It should be fully exploited. We have a unique opportunity now for combining private and public diplomacy. Let us grasp that opportunity. It may not come again. I am very well aware that the presence here of so many heads of state and heads of government meets the hopes of millions of people. They can take vital decisions on establishing a new look for our world and consequently also a new look for the United Nations. It is appropriate now to consider the position of the United Nations in relation to this era of nation building and new nationhoods. I tell you this, for a newly born or a newly reborn nation, the most precious possession is independence and sovereignty. Perhaps it may be, I don't know, but perhaps it may be that this sense of holding the precious jewel of sovereignty and independence is confined to the nations newly awakened. Perhaps as generations pass, the sense of pride and achievement grows dim. It may be so, but I don't think so. Even today, this is an international body. It is not yet either supranational nor supranational. It is an organization of nation states and can function only insofar as it is the will of those nation states that it do so. Have we all unanimously agreed to surrender any part of our sovereignty to this body? No, we have not. We have accepted the charter, and the charter is signed by fully sovereign, fully equal nation states. it may well be that this body should consider whether its members should surrender any part of their sovereignty to this international body. But if any such decision is made, it must be made freely and unanimously and equally. It must be made by all nations equally, the ancient and the new, the emergent nations and the old established, the developed and the underdeveloped. This is not something which can be imposed on any nation. Furthermore, the only possible basis for any such body as this is strict equality. The sovereignty of the newest nation or the smallest nation is just as precious, just as inviolable as the sovereignty of the biggest nation or the oldest nation. And furthermore again, any transgression against the sovereignty of any nation is a potential threat to the sovereignty of all nations. For 15 years now, the West has known peace, or at least the absence of war. Of course, there have been tensions. Yes, there has been danger. But the fact remains that in the midst of a revolution engulfing 3/4 of the world, the West has been at peace. Both great blocs, in fact, have successfully practiced coexistence for all those years, thus contradicting those who deny the possibility of coexistence. We of Asia, I repeat, we of Asia, we have not known peace. After peace came to Europe, we endured atomic bombs. We endured our own national revolution in Indonesia. We endured the torment of Vietnam. We suffered the torture of Korea. We still suffer the agony of Algeria. Is it now to be the turn of our African brothers? Are they to be tortured while our wounds are still unhealed? And yet, the West is still at peace. Do you wonder that we now demand, yes, demand respite from our torment? Do you wonder that now my voice is raised in protest? We, who were once voiceless, have demands and requirements. We have the right to be heard. We are not subject of barter, but living and virile nations with a role to play in this world and a contribution to make. I use its forms is a great and continuing danger. Imperialism is not yet dead. People sometimes say imperialism and colonialism is dead. No, imperialism is not yet dead. It is dying. Yes, the tide of history is washing over its battlements and undermining its foundations. Yes, the victory of independence and nationalism is certain. Still, and mark my words well, the dying imperialism is dangerous as the wounded tiger in a tropical jungle. I tell you this, and I am conscious of speaking now for my Asian and African brothers. The struggle for independence is always justified and always just. Those who resist that irresistible onward march of national independence and self-determination are blind. Those who seek to reverse what is irreversible are dangerous to themselves and to the world. Until these facts, and they are facts, are recognized, there will be no peace in this world and no release of tension. I appeal to you, please place the authority and the moral power of this organization of states behind those who struggle for freedom. Do that clearly, do that decisively, do that now, do that, and you will gain the full and wholehearted support of all men of goodwill. Do that now, and future generations will applaud you. I appeal to you, to all members of the United Nations, move with the tide of history. Do not try to stem that tide. The United Nations has now and today the opportunity of building for itself a great reputation and prestige. Those who struggle for freedom will seek support and allies where they can. How much better that they should turn to this body and to our charter rather than to any group or section of this body. Remove the causes of war and we shall be at peace. Remove the causes of tension and we shall be at rest. Do not delay. The time is short. The danger is great. Humanity the world over cries out for peace and rest, and those things are within our gift. Do not withhold them, lest this body be discredited and deserted. Our task is not to defend this world, but to build the world anew. The future, if there is to be a future, will judge us on the record of our success at this task. Do not, I beg you, older established nations, underestimate the force of nationalism. If you doubt its force, look around this chamber and compare it with San Francisco 15 years ago. Nationalism, victorious, triumphant nationalism has wrought this change, and it is good. Today, the world is enriched and ennobled by the wisdom of leaders of sovereign nations newly established. To mention but 6 examples from many, there is a Norodom Sihanouk, there is a Nasser, there is a Nehru, there is a Sekou Touré, there is a Mao Zedong in Peking, there is a Nkrumah. Is not the world a better place than they should sit here instead of devoting all their lives and all their strength to the overthrow of the imperialism which bound them? And their nations too are free, and my nation is free, and many more nations are free. Is not the world thus a better and a richer place? Indeed, I do not have to explain to you that we of Asia and Africa are opposed to colonialism and imperialism. More than that, who is there in the world today who will defend those things? They are universally condemned, and rightly so. And the old cynical arguments are no longer heard. Conflict now centers on when colonies are to be free, not on whether they are to be free. However, I will stress those who are discussing nuclear disarmament must never forget that we, who in this previously have been inarticulate, are watching and are hoping. We are watching and we are hoping, and yet we are filled with anxiety, because if nuclear warfare devastates our world, we too are the sufferers. No human being has the right to usurp the prerogative of God. No person has the right to use hydrogen bombs. No nation has the right to cause the probable destruction of all nations. No political system, no economic organization is worth the destruction of the world, including that system or organization itself. If the hydrogen-armed nations alone were involved in this issue, we of Asia and Africa would not care. We would only watch with detachment, filled with wonder, that those nations from which we have learned so much and which we have admired so much should today have sunk into such a morass of immorality. We could cry a curse upon you, and we could retire into our own balanced and peaceful world. But we cannot do that. Already we Asians have suffered atomic bombing. We Asians also are threatened again. And furthermore, we feel a moral duty to help in any way we can. We are not the enemies of the West nor of the East. We are part of this world and we wish to help. This is a cry from the heart of Asia. Let us help you to solve these problems. Perhaps you have looked at them too long and no longer see them clearly. Let us help you, and in helping you, we will help ourselves and all the future generations of all the world. It is obvious that the problem of disarmament is not only disagreement on narrow technical grounds. It is a question also of mutual trust. In fact, it is clear that on technical matters and on methods, the two blocs are not very far apart. The problem is rather one of mutual distrust. It is a problem open to solution by methods of discussion and diplomacy. Surely we of Asia and Africa and the other non-aligned countries can help in this. We are not short of experience and skill in negotiating. Perhaps our intermediation would be of value. Perhaps we could assist in finding a solution. Perhaps, who knows, perhaps we could show you the way to the only real disarmament, which is disarmament in the heart of man, the disarmament of man's mistrust and hatreds. Then it is the testing of those weapons. I know that there is scientific disagreement about the genetical effect of those tests. That disagreement, however, is in terms of the numbers affected. It is agreed that there are evil genetical effects. Have those who authorize the test ever seen the results of what they do? Have they looked at their own children and thought about those results? At the present time, the testing of nuclear weapons is suspended. Not, mark you well, not forbidden, but only suspended. Let that fact serve as a beginning then. Let that fact serve as the basis for prohibition of testing and then for real disarmament. Before leaving the subject of disarmament, I must make one more comment. To speak of disarmament is good. Seriously, to attempt the making of a disarmament agreement would be better. Best of all would be the implementation of an agreement on disarmament. However, let us be realistic. Even the implementation of a disarmament agreement would not guarantee peace to this sore and troubled world. Peace will come only when the causes of tension and conflict are removed. If there is a cause for conflict, then men will fight with pointed sticks if they have no other weapon. I know because my own nation did that very thing during our struggle for independence. We fought then with knives and pointed sticks. In order to make peace, we must remove the causes of tension and of conflict. That is why I spoke deep from my heart about the necessity of cooperation to bring about the final and glorious end of imperialism. Where there is imperialism and where there are simultaneously armed forces, then the position is a dangerous one indeed. Again, I speak from experience. That is the situation in West Irian. That is the situation in the 1/5 of our national territory which still labors under imperialism. There in West Irian, we have imperialism and the armed forces of imperialism. Bordering that territory, our own troops stand guard by land and sea. Those two bodies of troops face each other. And I tell you, that is an explosive situation. Very recently, those young and misguided troops who were in West Irian defending an outmoded conception were reinforced by an aircraft carrier, the Karl Doorman, from their remote homeland. I tell you that then the situation became positively dangerous. The commander-in-chief our present determined efforts to reach a solution by our own methods is part of our contribution towards securing the peace of this world. It is part of our effort to end this world problem of an obsolete evil. It is a determined surgical effort to remove the cancer of imperialism from the area of the world in which we have our life and being. I tell you in all seriousness, the situation in West Irian is a dangerous situation, an explosive situation. It is a cause of tension and it is a threat to peace. General Nasution is not responsible for that. Our soldiers are not responsible for that. Sukarno is not responsible for that. Indonesia is not responsible for that. No. The threat to peace springs directly from the very existence of colonialism and imperialism. Remove those checks to freedom and emancipation, and the threat to peace disappears. Eradicate imperialism, and the world becomes immediately and automatically a cleaner place, a better place, a more secure place. I know that when I say this, the minds of many will turn to the situation in the Congo. You may ask, has not imperialism been ejected from the Congo, with the result that there is now strife and bloodshed? It is not so. The deplorable situation in the Congo is caused directly and immediately by imperialism, not by its ending. Imperialism sought to maintain its foothold in the Congo, sought to mutilate and cripple the new state. That is why the Congo is in flames. Yes, there is agony in the Congo, but that agony is the birth pang of progress. An explosive progress always brings pain. Tearing up the deep roots of vested interests, national and international, always causes pain and dislocation. We know that. We know too from our own experience that development itself creates turbulence. A turbulent nation needs leadership and guidance, and it will eventually produce its own leadership and guidance. We Indonesians, we speak from bitter experience. The problem of the Congo, which is a problem of colonialism and imperialism, must be solved by application of those principles I have already mentioned. The Congo is a sovereign state. Let that sovereignty be respected. Remember, the sovereignty of the Congo is no less than the sovereignty of any nation represented in this assembly, and it must be respected equally. There must be no interference in the internal affairs of the Congo, and certainly no open or hidden support for disintegration. Yes, of course, that nation will make mistakes. We all make mistakes, and we all learn from mistakes. Yes, there will be turbulence, but let that go on too, for it is a sign of rapid growth and development. The extent of that turbulence is a question for the nation itself. Let us individually or collectively assist there, if we are requested to do so by the lawful government of that nation. However, any such assistance must be clearly based upon the unquestioned sovereignty of the Congo. Finally, have confidence in that nation. They are going through a time of great trial and are suffering deeply. Have confidence in them as a newly liberated nation, and they will find their own way to their own solution of their own problems. I will that the people of Algeria want independence. There can be no argument about that. If they had not, then this long and bitter and bloody struggle would have ended years ago. The thirst for independence and the determination to achieve that independence are the central factors of this situation. What is not yet decided is just how close and harmonious should be the future cooperation with France. Very close and very harmonious cooperation should not be difficult to achieve even at this stage, although perhaps it gets more difficult as the days of struggle pass. Then let a plebiscite be held under the United Nations in Algeria. To determine the wishes of the people on just how close and harmonious those relations should be. The plebiscite should not be concerned with the question of independence. That has been settled in blood and tears, and there certainly will be an independent Algeria. Plebiscite such as that I suggest would, if it is held soon, be the best guarantee that independent Algeria and France will have close and good cooperation for their mutual benefit. Again, I speak from experience. Indonesia had no intention of disrupting close and harmonious relations with the Netherlands. However, it seems that even today, as generations ago, the government of that nation insists upon giving too little and asking too much. Only when this became unbearable were those relations liquidated. Permit in Asia and Africa today, still living, still thinking, still acting, are those who have led their nations to independence, those who have evolved great liberating economic theories, those who have overthrown tyranny, those who have united their nations, and those who have defeated disruption of their nations. Thus, and very properly, we of Asia and Africa are turning towards each other for guidance and inspiration, and we are looking inwards towards the experience and the accumulated wisdom of our own nations. Do you not think that Asia and Africa perhaps have a message and a method for the whole world? It was the great British philosopher Bertrand Russell who once said that mankind is now divided into two groups. One group follows the teachings of Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of American Independence. The other group follows the teachings of the Communist Manifesto. But pardon me, Lord Russell, pardon me, I think you have forgotten something. I think you have forgotten about more than 1,000 million people, the people of Asia and Africa, and possibly also of Latin America, who follow neither the Communist Manifesto nor the Declaration of Independence. Mind you, we admire both, and we have learned much from both, and we have been inspired by both. We could fail, who could fail to be inspired by the words and the spirit of the Declaration of Independence? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among those rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Who, deeply engaged in the struggle for national life and liberty, could fail to be inspired? And again, who amongst us, struggling to establish a just and prosperous society upon the devastation of colonialism, could fail to be inspired by the vision and cooperation and economic emancipation evoked by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels? Now there is confrontation between those two outlooks, and this confrontation is dangerous, not only to those who confront each other, but also to the rest of the world. I cannot speak for the rest of Asia and Africa. I am not empowered to do so, and in any case, they are well able to express their own views. However, I am empowered, indeed instructed, to speak for my own nation of 92 million people. The torrent of history shows clearly that all nations need some such conception and ideal. If they do not have it, or if it becomes obscured and obsolete, then that nation is in danger. Our own Indonesian history shows that clearly, and so indeed does the history of the whole world. We call this something the Pancasila. Pancha is 5, Sila is principle. We call this something Pancasila. Pancasila, or the 5 pillars of our state. These 5 pillars do not spring directly from either the Communist Manifesto nor the Declaration of Independence. Indeed, they are ideas and ideals which have, perhaps for centuries, been implicit amongst our people. It is indeed not surprising that concepts of great strength and virility should have arisen in our nation during the 2,000 years of our civilization and during the centuries of strong nationhood before imperialism engulfed us in a moment of national weakness. In speaking to you of Pancasila, I am expressing the essence of 2,000 years of our civilization. What then are those 5 pillars? They are quite simple. First, belief in God. Second, nationalism. Third, internationalism. Fourth, democracy. Fifth, social justice. Belief in God, nationalism, internationalism, democracy, social justice. Very simple. Permit me now to expand a little on those 5 points. First, belief in God. My nation includes those who follow many different religions. There are Mohammedans, there are Christians, there are Buddhists in Indonesia, and there are men of no religion. However, to 85% of our 92 million people, the Indonesian nation is made up of followers of Islam. Springing from this fact and in recognition of the unified diversity of our nation, we place belief in God as the forefront of our philosophy of life. Even those who follow no God in their innate tolerance recognize that belief in the Almighty is characteristic of their nation, and so accept this first sila. Then number 2, nationalism. The burning force of nationalism and the desire for independence sustained us and gave us strength during the long colonial night, and during the struggle for independence. Today, that burning force is still within us and still sustains us. But our nationalism is most certainly not chauvinism. We most certainly do not regard ourselves as superior to other nations. We most certainly do not seek to impose ourselves on other nations. I know well that the word nationalism is suspect and even discredited in the West. That is because the West has itself prostituted and distorted nationalism. And yet true nationalism still burns bright in the West. If it had not, then the West would not have challenged with arms the aggressive chauvinism of Hitler. Our third pillar is internationalism. There is no conflict or contradiction between nationalism and internationalism. Indeed, internationalism cannot grow and flourish except in the rich soil of nationalism. Is not this Organization of United Nations clear evidence of that? Previously, there was the League of Nations. Now there is the United Nations. The very names proclaim that neither could have existed without the existence of nations and nationalism. And yet, the very existence of both shows that the nations desire and need an international body in which each is equal. Internationalism is most certainly not cosmopolitanism, which is a denial of nationalism, which is anti-national and indeed anti-reality. Rather, true internationalism is an expression of true nationalism, in which each nation respects and guards the rights of all nations, big and small, old and new. True internationalism is a sign that the nation has become adult and responsible, forsaking childish ideas of national or racial superiority, forsaking the infantile disorders of chauvinism and cosmopolitanism. Fourthly, there is democracy. Democracy is not the monopoly or the invention of the Western social orders. Rather, democracy seems to be the natural condition of man, although it is modified to fit particular social conditions. During the millennia of our Indonesian civilization, we have evolved our own Indonesian democratic forms. It is our belief that these forms have an international relevance and significance. This is a question to which I shall return later. Finally, the last sila, the ultimate pillar, is social justice. With this, we link social prosperity, for we regard the two as inseparable. Indeed, only a prosperous society can be a just society, although prosperity itself can reside in social injustice. Then, that is our Pancasila. belief in God, nationalism, internationalism, democracy, social justice. Those are the principles which my nation fully accepts and uses as its guide to all political activity, economic activity, social activity. We of Indonesia are not prepared to sit idly back while the world goes to ruin. We are not prepared to have the clear morning of our independence overshadowed by radioactive clouds. No nation of Asia or Africa is prepared to do this. We have a responsibility to the world, and we are ready to accept and fulfill that responsibility. If that means intervening in what has previously been the affairs of great powers remote from us, then we are prepared to do that. No nation of Asia or Africa will shirk that task. What would be the international application of Pancasila? How could it work in practice? Let us take the 5 points one by one briefly. First then, belief in God. No person who accepts the Declaration of American Independence as a guide to life and action will deny that. And equally, certainly no follower of the Communist Manifesto would, in this international forum today, deny the right to believe in the Almighty. For further elucidation about that, I refer to Mr. Aidit. Mr. Aidit, sitting there, the leader of the Indonesian Communist Party, who sits in my delegation and accepts wholeheartedly both the Communist Manifesto and the Pancasila. Second, nationalism. We are all representatives of nations. How then can we reject nationalism? To do so would be to reject our own nations and to reject the sacrifices of generations. But I warn you, if you accept the principle of nationalism, then you must reject imperialism. But to that warning, I will add a reminder. If you reject imperialism, then automatically and immediately you remove from this troubled world a major cause of tension and conflict. The third point is internationalism. Is it necessary to speak at length about internationalism in this international body? Surely not. If our nations were not internationally minded, then those nations would not be members of this organization. However, true internationalism is not always found here. I regret the necessity of saying that, but it is a fact. True internationalism is not always found here. Only too often the United Nations is used as a forum for narrow national or sectional aims. Only too often the great purposes of high ideals of our charter are obscured by the search for national advantage or national prestige. True internationalism must be based upon the fact of national equality. True internationalism must be based upon equality of regard, equality of esteem, upon the practical application of the truth that all men are brothers. It must, to quote the Charter of the United Nations, that document which is so often forgotten, it must reaffirm faith in the equal rights of nations large and small. Finally, and once more, internationalism would mean the ending of imperialism and colonialism, and thus the ending of many dangers and tensions. Fourth, democracy. For us of Indonesia, democracy contains three essential elements. Three. It contains, first, the principle of what we call mufakat, that is unanimity. It contains, secondly, the principle of perwakilan, that is representation. Finally, democracy contains for us the principle of musyawarah, and that is deliberation between representatives. Yes, Indonesian democracy contains those three: unanimity, representation, deliberation between representatives. These principles of our democratic way of life are deeply enshrined within our people and have been from time immemorial. They ruled our democratic way of life when wild and savage tribes still roamed over Europe. They guided us when few Look, not so very long ago, as you know, representatives of 29 nations of Asia and Africa met together in Bandung. Those leaders of their nations were no impractical dreamers. Far from it. They were hard, realistic leaders of men and of nations, most of them graduates of the struggle for national freedom, all of them well versed in the realities of political as well as international life and leadership. They were of diverse political outlook, ranging from the extreme left to the extreme right. Many in the West did not believe that such a conference could produce anything worthwhile. Many even believed that it would break up in confusion and mutual recrimination, torn apart on the rock of political differences. But the Asian African Conference succeeded. The Asian African Conference was conducted by methods of musyawarah, of deliberation. There were no majorities, no minorities, there was no voting, there were only deliberations and only the common desire to reach an agreement. Out of that conference came an unanimous communique, which is one of the most important achievements of this decade and perhaps one of the most important documents of history. Finally, in the Pancasila, there is social justice. To be applied on the international field, this should perhaps be international social justice. Once again, to accept the principle, this principle would be to reject colonialism and imperialism. Furthermore, the acceptance of social justice as an aim by these United Nations would mean the acceptance of certain responsibilities and duties. It would mean a determined, united effort to end many of the social evils which trouble our world. It would mean that aid to the technically underdeveloped and the less fortunate nations would be removed from the atmosphere of Cold War. It would also mean the practical recognition that all men are brothers and that all men have a responsibility to their brothers. Of course, the United Nations consists of more than the Charter of the United Nations. Nevertheless, that historic document remains the guiding star and the inspiration of this organization. In many ways, the Charter reflects the political and power constellation of the time of its origin. In many ways, the Charter does not reflect the realities of today. Let us consider then whether the 5 principles I have enunciated would make our Charter stronger and better. I believe yes, I firmly believe that the adoption of those 5 principles and the writing of them into the Charter would greatly strengthen the United Nations. I believe it would bring the United Nations into line with the recent development of the world. I believe it would make it possible for the United Nations to face the future refreshed and confident. Finally, I believe that the adoption of Pancasila as a foundation of the Charter would make the Charter more wholeheartedly acceptable to all members, both old and new. I will make one further point in this direction. It is a great honor to have the seat of the United Nations within one's country. We are all grateful indeed to the United States of America that the United States of America has offered a permanent home to our organization. However, it might well be questioned whether this is advisable. I am convinced that an Asian or African country, in its faith and belief, would gladly offer hospitality to the United Nations, perhaps setting aside a sufficient area wherein the organization itself would be sovereign and in which the discussions vital to the vital work can take place in security and brotherhood. The United Nations is no longer the same body as that which signed the Charter 15 years ago. Nor is this world the same world. Those who labored in wisdom to produce the charter of this organization could not have foreseen the shape which it has taken today. Of those wise and far-sighted men, but few realized that the end of imperialism was in sight, and that if this organization was to live, then it must provide for a great and overbearing and invigorating influx of new and reborn nations. With all respect, I submit that it might not be so. The fact that the seat of the United Nations is in the territory of one of the Cold War protagonists has meant that the Cold War has worked its way even into the work and the administration and household of our organization. So much so, indeed, that the very attendance at this session of the leader of a great nation has become a Cold War issue and a Cold War weapon and a means of sharpening that dangerous and futile way of life. Let us inquire whether the seat of our organization should not be removed from the atmosphere of Cold War. Let us inquire whether Asia from the Cold War, uncommitted to either bloc, and where the delegates can move easily and freely where they will, and in doing so, perhaps gain a wider understanding of the world and its problems. The purpose of the United Nations should be to solve problems. To use it as a mere debating platform, or as a propaganda outlet, or as an extension of domestic politics, is to pervert the high ideals which should imbue this body. In order to modernize and make efficient our organization, perhaps even the Secretariat, under the leadership of its Secretary General, may need to be revised. In saying this, I am not, most definitely not, in any way criticizing or denouncing the present Secretary General, who is striving to do a good job under outmoded conditions which must at times seem impossible. how then can they be efficient? How can members of those two groups in the world, groups which are a reality and which must be accepted, how can members of those two groups feel at ease in this organization and have the necessary utmost confidence in it? Since the war, we have witnessed three great permanent phenomena. First is the rise of the socialist countries. That was not foreseen in 1945. Second is the great wave of national liberation and economic emancipation which has swept over Asia and Africa and over our brothers in Latin America. I think that only we who were directly involved anticipated that. Third is the great scientific advance which at first dealt in weapons of war, and war, but which is turning now to the barriers and frontiers of space. Who could have prophesied this? It is true that our charter can be revised. I am aware that there exists a procedure for doing so and a time when it can be done. But this question is urgent. It may be a matter of life and death for the United Nations. No narrow legalistic thinking should prevent this being done at once. Equally, it is essential that the distribution of seats in the Security Council and the other bodies and agencies should be revised. I am not thinking in this matter in terms of block votes, but I am thinking of the urgency that the Charter of the United Nations, bodies and its Secretariat should all reflect the true position of our present world. We of Indonesia regard this body with great hope and yet with great fear. We regard it with great hope because it was useful to us in our struggle for national life. We regard it with great hope because we believe that only some such organization as this can provide the framework for the sane and secure world we crave. We regard it with great fear because we have presented one great national issue, the issue of West Irian, before this assembly, and no solution has been found. We regard it with fear because great powers of the world have introduced their dangerous Cold War game into its halls. We regard it with fear lest it should fail and go the way of its predecessor and thus remove from the eyes of men a vision of secure and united future. Let us face the fact that this organization in its present methods and by its present form is a product of the Western state system. Pardon me, but I cannot regard that system with reverence. I cannot even regard it with very much affection, although I do respect it greatly. Imperialism and colonialism were offspring of that Western state system, and in common with the vast majority of this organization, I hate imperialism. I detest colonialism. And I fear the consequences of their last bitter struggle for life. Twice within my own lifetime, the Western state system has torn itself to shreds and once almost destroyed the world in bitter conflict. Can you wonder that so many of us look at this organization, which is also a product of the Western state system, with a question in our eyes? Please do not misunderstand me. We respect and admire that system. We have been inspired by the words of Lincoln and of Lenin, by the deeds of Washington and by the deeds of Garibaldi, even perhaps we look with envy upon some of the physical achievements of the West, but we are determined that our nations and the world as a whole shall not be the plaything of one small corner of the world. We do not seek to defend the world we know. We seek to build a better world. As a practical step in this direction, it is my honor and my duty to submit a draft resolution to this General Assembly. On behalf of the delegations of Ghana, India, the United Arab Republic, Yugoslavia, and Indonesia, I hereby submit the following resolution. The General Assembly, deeply concerned with the recent deterioration in international relations which threatens the world with grave consequences, aware of the great expectancy of the world that this Assembly will assist in helping to prepare the way for the easing of world tension, conscious of the grave and urgent responsibility that rests on the United Nations to initiate helpful efforts, requests as a first urgent step the President of the United States of America and the Chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics to renew their contacts interrupted recently, so that their declared willingness to find solutions of the outstanding problems by negotiations may be progressively implemented. Mr. President, may I request on behalf of the delegations of the above-mentioned 5 nations that this resolution receive your urgent consideration. A letter to this effect, signed by the heads of the delegations of Ghana, India, the United Arab Republic, Yugoslavia, and Indonesia, has already been sent to the Secretariat. I submit the draft resolution on behalf of those 5 delegations and on behalf of the millions of people in those nations. To accept this resolution is a possible and immediately step. Let this General Assembly accept this resolution as soon as possible. Let us take this practical step towards an easing of the dangerous tension in our world. Let us carry this resolution unanimously so that the full force of the world's concern may be felt. Let us take this first step and let us determine to continue our activity and pressure until our world becomes the better and more secure world we envisage. That world in which all nations exist in peace and brotherhood. Build the world fit for the dreams and the ideals of humanity. Break now with the past, for the day is at its dawning. Break now with the past, so that we can justify ourselves with the future. I pray God Almighty will bless and guide the deliberations of this assembly. I thank you all.